Much. So good afternoon, everybody. I hadn't really realized, because it's still morning here in England, that of course you've just had your lunch. So if the person sitting next to you goes to sleep, please, nudge them awake. So I've got the after lunch slot where, yes, everyone's very relaxed, but I say you might just go to sleep. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about tools to support educators to think about educational space. My background is in education rather than architecture, and I've spent quite a lot of my time working with other people from an education background to think about the spaces they use. But why do they need to think about spaces? Well, because space matters, and if you're coming to this from more of an architectural perspective, that's not a controversial thing for me to say, but perhaps educators don't always think about the space explicitly. Okay, so I'm trying to get my slides to advance and they are not doing it. Okay, so this is a very brief. I now have one slide which tells you everything you need to know about the evidence base for the impact, the effect of the physical environment on education. Okay, there are positive correlations between the quality of space and quality of learning, and that's come out in quite a lot of studies. But there are actually very few direct effects on learning, and generally they're about poor environments, so too noisy, too hot, too cold, poor air quality. And I know you've had particular issues with that in the Nordic countries. That directly impairs learning. But they have to be pretty bad, it has to be said, with the exception of poor air quality, which can be achieved quite easily. You have to get really noisy or really hot or really cold before you directly impair learning. That's not to say you wouldn't indirectly impair it, because everyone gets frustrated because it's a bit on the hot side, a bit on the cold side. And that's where I'm going next. Loads of indirect effects on education through teaching, learning, and the other things that go on in education. So that's much more important, really, than the direct effects on sort of cognitive function. And because of this, reviews of the evidence continue to conclude that it's the use of the space that's really key. And Weinstein, in a review done nearly 50 years ago, that's basically what she said. A review I was involved with nearly 20 years ago, the Higgins et al., that's something like what we said. And then Jill Blackmore, 15 years ago nearly, in the Australian context, she's also said that sort of thing. So in a nutshell, school settings, including the material resources, the design, the organisation, they facilitate some things, some pedagogical and social practices, while hindering others. And that's where your impact, your effects come from. And a sort of range of articles that loads of, I could have quoted, cited lots of things there. I've gone for things I find interesting particularly, and a range of settings, British, Australian, Nordic countries, and a British again. Okay, so my takeaway message: get the basic physical features right. So get your architects to get the basic stuff right, but then consider what the educational space is intended to facilitate and achieve. And this is where it needs to not just be about architects and construction experts, but also bring in the schools and the teachers. Okay, so what does that mean for teachers and schools? So the one big message is the importance of teachers understanding the spaces and resources they're using. So this nice quote from a couple of Swedish researchers: in their day-to-day work, teachers have to continually interpret and negotiate the affordances of their educational environments. And my other takeaway message is that because of this importance of the physical space, it can be really key to making changes or innovating in education. But just changing the space doesn't necessarily make the bigger changes you might want to. It's only part of this whole thing. Okay, another message, perhaps more for architects, is teachers do notice space. Architects sometimes think that teachers don't. I've already said education people tend not to talk much about physical spaces. I've always been in a bit of a niche, had a niche interest in education, in being interested in physical space. But that's not to say they don't implicitly notice the space and try to use it well. And this happens in traditional classrooms. So here's some work by Paola did some years ago in traditional classrooms in Uruguay, where the teacher clearly, is reflecting on how they use that traditional space. Similarly, within innovative learning environments, this time in Australia, again, teachers talking about how they're thinking about the space. And my other point, change does happen. So teachers notice the space and change does happen. And here I've got lots of images of innovative schools in Iceland and England, and also an older school. You can just see it behind the innovation outside that they've got in the bottom left-hand corner. So that's really quite an old English school, but they've done some quite innovative things in the playground and possibly indoors as well. So yeah, change does happen, both in policy and practice in education, but these are not always coordinated. So people who've looked at other change processes in education have made this point often. And school environments have changed over time, as these images suggest. And educational innovation is sometimes reflected in the physical space, but, and here's a big but, change in education is known to be challenging. So whether that's changing spaces or changing other aspects of pedagogy or curriculum, change in education is known to be challenging. Okay, so yes, another takeaway message, change is more successful when it's collaborative. And another thing to make your space more effective is trying to align the design and use. Various frameworks have been developed. You may be familiar with some of these. I've used Gislerson's framework a lot. I also quite like the framework from Goodyear and colleagues in Australia, where they talk about sort of aligning the set, the physical sort of situation, the task you set, and the social setup. But again, takeaway message, the success of the educational space and its use depends on these aspects sort of cohering, not conflicting. They've got to be in alignment, working together. You get mismatches where you've got a space that's set up for one thing and organizational features that don't work with that space. You're going to have problems. Okay, so there's lots of issues, and how do we address them? And I think a really important thing that can begin to address lots of these issues, these challenges, is to work collaboratively. So that's both within schools, so this is what's happening here, various staff within the school, so people with different roles within education are working collaboratively to understand their own space. But it's bigger than that. I also, it's important to think about working collaboratively between education and architecture, which obviously is part of what we're doing here. So yes, for thinking about working collaboratively within schools, school communities can then assess that alignment between the spaces, what they're trying to do there, what the staff think about the spaces, how the children use the spaces. And you can have participatory approaches to planning change, which we know will be more successful than non-participatory approaches to change. So what does that look like in practice? Well, school designs we know aren't sort of universally appropriate. Paola showed you some schools in Uruguay, and yeah, they're recognizably like schools, but they're quite different to what we have in England, what you've got in Finland. So school designs won't be completely transferable across the world, but these sort of collaborative approaches to planning might be, and certainly I'm arguing they can be. So here's an approach I took in a British government-run primary school of 400 students aged 4 to 11, planning refurbishment. Paola then used the same techniques, the same activities in a very different context, a private school in Uruguay, many more students and a wider age range to design a new preschool facility. Okay, you can read about it here. So we started with mapping, then we did some diamond ranking, so getting people to rank images of learning environments and thus make explicit their views about how space relates to learning. And finally, a sort of collage to plan changes in a very concrete way. Paola did the same thing in Uruguay, and it worked really well in both contexts. Okay, so more tools for thinking collaboratively about school space. I haven't got time to go into this here. You've heard something about co-read from Carolina, and yeah, please go on the website and have a look at what we've got. So again, more tools for collaboratively thinking and planning change or understanding school space. Can be used both by educators and others. We were particularly thinking of educators, but that doesn't need to be just educators. And it's not just about planning. at the beginning of a change. So I've also been involved with putting together this framework for collaborative school design, trying to think about what educational activities can be happening while the architectural stuff is going on. So while the architects are planning and the constructors are building, what can the education people be doing? What can the education side of things look like? And I say this goes well beyond some participatory planning. It's thinking about how educators are perhaps supported to get ready, perhaps talking to the designers again about what this building's going to look like. And then moving in and perhaps feeding back to the designers and reflecting further on as a part of the post-occupancy evaluation. And so that's my overall framework for this. The co-read tools similarly can be used at different stages. And we have got case studies of their use at these different stages: planning for change, the sort of in-use or post-occupancy evaluation, and sort of later reflection, which of course then can sometimes lead back onto more planning for change. So that's it. When you've got access to the slides, you'll be able to follow these links to these various things I've pointed to, and I hope some of them prove to be useful. Oh yes, and you can follow up the references. If you spot any missing ones, please do get in contact with me. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.